Hello there, this is part 7 of my pre-HD Skyward Sword deep dive series. If you'd like to see the other parts, there will be a link to the full playlist in the description. In previous parts, I've talked about the overworld design, progression, and gameplay, so I'd recommend watching all of those first. Enjoy! Dungeons are often the highlights of the Zelda experience, so the promise of an upcoming dungeon at the end of a rough gameplay segment can sometimes be motivation enough to keep pushing through it. Skyward Sword's dungeons are no different, and they also have a little bit extra going for them as well. The overworld already has a dungeon-like design that introduces players to gameplay concepts, so the dungeons have a chance to build on these already established concepts instead of having to introduce brand new mechanics within the dungeons themselves. Each dungeon works to varying degrees of success in both their theming and dungeon design, but overall I'd say they're okay. I don't have much to say about Skyview Temple. The visual theme is that it's a plain abandoned temple, and design-wise it's very standard and straightforward, even for a first dungeon. Faron Woods was mostly about learning the basics of the motion controls, so Skyview Temple continues this by focusing on slightly more involved sword motions and gyro aiming. You get the beetle here, and it's introduced and built up fairly well, but the beetle is pretty boring to use and a bit too slow before you can upgrade it, so this dungeon was pretty dull and plodding. I'm kind of inclined to give it a free pass, since newer players are probably still getting used to the motion controls at this point, but it's nothing to write home about. The Earth Temple is hands down the worst dungeon in Skyward Sword. It's a basic lava-filled cavern, and while it does have some nice architecture, there's not much else to visually set it apart from Elden Volcano, besides that it's in a cave instead of outside. The Volcano introduces the new bomb mechanics, and in the Earth Temple you get the bomb bag, so this was the perfect chance to really use the new bomb mechanics in some fun and unique ways. But you barely use the bombs here, besides to blow up a few walls marked on your map and to roll one bomb down a slope. It makes both the previous overworld design and the dungeon item feel like a waste. Instead, the Earth Temple is all about this one-off gimmick of rolling around on top of a giant boulder through lava. It's a fun enough set piece, but it doesn't ask anything of you besides just walking along a straight path with a couple of very simple obstacles. Other than that, you're hopping around on platforms and running up a few slopes. There's nothing much going on here. With no interesting puzzles, no unique challenges, sparse combat, and a non-existent dungeon theme, almost everything about the Earth Temple is a complete letdown. Also, there's all this dragon imagery everywhere, but the temple doesn't have anything to do with dragons, even though there are dragons in Skyward Sword, which is just a baffling choice to me. The Lanayru mining facility isn't the best dungeon in Skyward Sword, but I honestly love it, and it's my personal favorite dungeon here for a number of reasons. It's an abandoned high-tech facility that was used to mine the timeshift stones that appear throughout all of Lanayru. This is a really captivating concept, and it builds on the setting of the Lanayru Desert in such a unique way. The visual design here is superb, since the two time zones are really distinct from each other. In the present, everything is quiet and forlorn and just a bit ominous, but in the past, the facility is vibrant, with color and motion everywhere as machinery springs to life around you. This dungeon also successfully builds on all of the mechanics introduced in the overworld. Timeshift stones can now be found in minecarts, so they create pathways and obstacles around them as they move along a track. I do think the pace for this is too slow, and it's a bit too simple here, but I still think it's a solid development on timeshift stones that builds on how they can be used as a mechanic. Plus, it gets expanded on later for a great challenge in the Lanayru Gorge, which really can't be said for most other mechanics in Skyward Sword. You also get the Gust Bellows here, and they're used in a lot of creative ways within the mining facility. They can blow away desert sand and floating explosive enemies in the present, and in the past, all of the ancient technology is operated by the Gust Bellows. You even get to use them in combat. Armos have a colorful screw on their head, and blowing on it causes them to crank open like a nutcracker so you can hit their weak point. It's pretty fun. You only fight Armos a couple of times, which really makes them stand out here too. This is the type of combat variety that I think the game needed more of. The mining facility is pretty simplistic and straightforward, but it's satisfying in how it builds on the mechanics and themes from the overworld while still being unique in its own right. This dungeon also trusts you to navigate it on your own, which is a major plus. I distinctly noticed on reaching the end that I hadn't been given any instructions, which is a rarity for the dungeons in this game. More on that later. The Ancient Cistern is a very unique dungeon that's sort of a half water temple, half shadow temple fusion. It's based on the Japanese story of the Spider's Thread, which is such an intriguing real-world influence to base a dungeon on. The visuals here are absolutely gorgeous and some of the best in the game, and there's an even better visual dichotomy here than there was in the mining facility. The Lotus Pond segments are serene and beautiful, while the underworld is really creepy and menacing. This dichotomy even extends to the actual dungeon design too. The Lotus Pond segments are all about solving water-based puzzles while navigating passages looping around a large central room, while the underworld is a straightforward gauntlet of platforming and combat against hordes of cursed bokoblins. Each part really stands out from the other, and taken together they make a very unique whole, but the trade-off is that neither part quite stands out on its own. Many of the mechanics are pretty underdeveloped because they're only explored through half of the dungeon. For example, cranking pipes to make water spouts is a fun idea, but it's not expanded on in any way, and reversing the rotation of spinning pillars is only done once in the underworld. The raising and lowering of the central statue is particularly notable. It could have been a really cool central feature of the dungeon, but it was only used for one puzzle that you're told the answer to. There's also a lot of climbing on vines here, which isn't very enjoyable, and the terrible swimming mechanics are also on display. Other than one larger scale puzzle in the central room, swimming is thankfully kept to a bare minimum, but it still kind of makes the dungeon weaker just by being here. The Ancient Cistern doesn't have the strongest gameplay, but the experience is bolstered quite a bit by the introduction of the whip. It's used in a lot of fun ways here, like swinging from branches, yanking flying enemies out of the air, and even stealing a key from a bokoblin guard's belt. Between the fantastic use of the whip, the really unique dungeon design, and the incredible visual theme, I think the Ancient Cistern more than makes up for its flaws. It's a very memorable experience and a great dungeon overall. Skipping the Sandship for just a moment, the Fire Sanctuary was a major disappointment to me. I love the idea of an outdoor dungeon weaving between two cliff sides, and the visual design is pretty lovely, but the overall theme is just too similar to the Earth Temple. They're both lava-filled dungeons that take place in caverns and mountainsides on the volcano, which makes all of Eldin blend together too much. I'm definitely not expecting every dungeon to be as unique and creative as the mining facility or Ancient Cistern, but even with basic visual themes, Wind Waker had the same number of dungeons as Skyward Sword and kept them all visually and thematically distinct from each other. The gameplay here is also really disjointed and unsatisfying. There's a mechanic that has you stabbing water fruit with your sword and then tossing it to douse fires, which is used in a few different ways, but it's extremely simplistic since it just uses basic sword motions. It's also barely expanded on. The only somewhat involved use it gets is in solidifying the Magma Hand mini-bosses. Other than that, it's just stab and then swipe at a target. The Fire Sanctuary is Skyward Sword's 6th dungeon, and its central mechanic is less involved than some of the mechanics used in the first dungeon. Water Fruit might have been acceptable in the Earth Temple, but definitely not here. Most of the navigation outside of this is really basic traversal and random tedious tasks, like blowing on hot coals with the gust bellows or using the beetle to bomb rocks. Plus, halfway through the dungeon, you get the magma mitts and have to use them to do a bunch of awful digging minigames, which has nothing to do with anything else going on here. I think the Fire Sanctuary is supposed to be more of a combat-focused dungeon, with a lot of enemies and mini-bosses, which is a style of dungeon that I'm normally fine with. However, it takes place at a point when the sword combat is already wearing thin, and there's all this weird extraneous stuff going on with water fruits and digging minigames, so it feels like a disjointed mess of an experience. I do think that it's better than the Earth Temple because you're doing some interesting things, but I honestly thought this dungeon was pretty awful. Alright, the Sandship is the big one. It's possibly the defining dungeon of Skyward Sword, and it's hard to argue that it isn't the best dungeon on display here. A lot of people would even say that it's one of the best in the entire series, but I actually thought it had some major flaws that really hampered the experience, and I was honestly kind of surprised to find it pretty middling. I have a lot to say on the Sandship, so bear with me here. I do agree that the Sandship is one of the most unique and memorable dungeons in the entire series. It's a derelict pirate ship stranded in the middle of the desert, which is an amazing dungeon concept on its own. However, it also has a single timeshift stone at the top of the mast that shifts the entire dungeon into a high-tech mechanical vessel sailing the open seas. I love how this takes the concept of the Sand Sea, where you were also sailing on a boat powered by a timeshift stone, and absolutely runs with it. Not only is it visually stunning, but it also leads to some really intriguing puzzle solving, since you're constantly looking for new ways to hit the timeshift stone with the bow from different parts of the ship, and then puzzle out what changes in the layout. There are a couple of really cool moments where you have to consider the entire dungeon's layout to figure out how to proceed, which is honestly fantastic. Heck, even the mini-boss is amazing. It's this really intense duel against a robot pirate captain on the bow of the ship. You have severely restricted mobility and have to aggressively push the captain backwards off the edge while he's pressuring you backwards into a steadily advancing, damaging barricade. Precise sword swings and effective parrying take on a whole new level of urgency and attest your sword skills in a truly unique way. The Sandship has a brilliant concept and some solid mechanics, and it leaves a very strong impression. Unfortunately, the experience is marred by a number of flaws. First off, the actual progression through the dungeon is kind of terrible. The puzzles are great, but most of the puzzles are located in isolated rooms that are completely disconnected from each other, and you have to spend so much time running back and forth down vast, empty hallways to get to them. Right at the start, you have to spend several minutes running down hallways that line the entire dungeon just to get a key, and then turn around and run all the way back to the deck. And then after activating the timeshift stone, you spend the next 10 to 20 minutes running back and forth down these same exact hallways between isolated rooms. After freeing the crew in the brig, you have to run all the way back to the deck again into the captain's quarters to get the boss key, and then you have to run all the way back again to reach the boss door. Even using the dinghy on the side of the ship as a shortcut, it's just so monotonous, and there isn't much sense of forward momentum because most of the ship is already open. Those couple of moments where you have to consider the ship's full layout are fantastic, but more often than not, you just have to leave the room that you're in and run down an empty hallway to a different room. Along with this, most of the dungeon is spent following the instructions of the robot crew on the ship. They'll explain to you exactly what you should be doing next at every turn, and they forcibly open your map repeatedly to show you your next destination. Part of the fun of dungeon crawling is figuring out how to proceed for yourself, so constantly being told where to go and what to do by NPCs honestly spoiled the experience for me. I'm not even opposed to a dungeon with this style of NPC-guided progression. For example, Snow Peak Ruins in Twilight Princess does something similar, but it's a fantastic dungeon in my opinion. Two Yetis named Yetta and Yetto live here, who help you during your visit. Yetta will mark on your map where to go next, and figuring out how to get to each marked spot and then back again is the challenge. It's actually engaging here because Snow Peak Ruins is a huge mansion of interconnected rooms. Being told your next destination in the Sandship just involves running down an empty hallway, so it's never engaging, even if the puzzles in each room are. The guidance in Snow Peak Ruins is also really entertaining. You're trying to find the boss key, but Yetta can't seem to remember where she put it, and she keeps sending you the wrong way. You'll instead find random food items where she sends you, and then when you return, Yetto excitedly shoves you down and steals it for the soup he's cooking for Yetta. It's so silly and cute. You're allowed to have as much of his healing soup as you'd like, and each ingredient added doubles the healing effect, so it's also still rewarding even though you're technically going the wrong way. The NPCs in the Sandship don't have any personality like this. They just tell you what to do and wait for you to do it. The ship is taken over by dangerous pirates, but you really don't get the sense that the robots are in any danger, since they don't act like it, and the dungeon is entirely about puzzle solving. Plus, throughout Snow Peak Ruins, Yetta has a mysterious illness that's caused by the Twilight Mirror Shard, which is why she's having memory trouble and why Yetto is cooking the soup for her in the first place. And the boss fight of Snow Peak Ruins is against Yetta after she's been fully corrupted by the shard, so the dungeon tells a full story. In the Sandship, your goal is to free the robot crew and take the ship back from the pirates, but as soon as you unlock the boss door, the entire ship instead starts getting destroyed by a random sea monster. It's an exciting escape sequence, but also totally undermines all of the puzzle solving and navigation you just had to go through, and it doesn't really have anything to do with what your quest in the Sandship actually was. Not to mention the boss fight itself, which I'll get to later. Gameplay guidance has been tuned in Skyward Sword HD, but I've watched a playthrough of the Sandship, and the issue isn't fixed here. I don't think it can totally be fixed, since the dungeon is designed around following the instructions of the robot crew. If there's one thing that they could have fixed, it's Fi's excessive hand-holding in this dungeon. Fi is definitely an issue with Skyward Sword as a whole, but she was uniquely horrible in the Sandship compared to every other dungeon. She interrupts you over and over again to explain very basic dungeon concepts, things like how to hit switches and what boss doors and boss keys are, which is so aggravating since even the previous desert dungeon had no instructions in it. What's even more aggravating is if you solve any puzzles before you're explicitly told to by the robot crew, Fi actually chastises you for doing the wrong thing. And at the end, when the Sandship is under attack and you have to escape, she stops you multiple times to inform you that the ship is under attack and you should escape. It's borderline self-parody. At least in Skyward Sword HD, you can skip her dialogue, which makes the Sandship a lot more enjoyable, but in the original Wii version, Fi almost single-handedly ruins the experience here. I want to call the Sandship a great dungeon because of the fantastic dungeon theme and creative mechanics on display, and I really do respect the positives, but they just don't outweigh the flaws to me in the same way they do with the mining facility in Ancient Cistern. I do still think it's pretty good overall, but to be completely honest, I didn't even enjoy playing through the Sandship. I was so thoroughly exasperated by the end of it. The issues on display here with backtracking and hand-holding and random interruptions do exist throughout all of Skyward Sword, but at least compared to the other dungeons, they're at their absolute worst in the Sandship. It's so unfortunate that some truly incredible dungeon design is marred by inherent problems with Skyward Sword as a game, and Skyward Sword's unique design does impact every dungeon this way. To be clear, Skyward Sword's design can have a positive impact on the dungeons, and it has a lot of potential. Both of Lanayru's dungeons really successfully build on the mechanics and themes introduced in the overworld segments, while putting enough of a unique twist on them to make the dungeons stand out on their own. It makes Lanayru feel like a totally interconnected and fleshed out region of the world, which is another reason why Lanayru is fantastic and really shows how Skyward Sword's unique design could have been used to great effect throughout the entire game. However, while the design bolsters these two dungeons, it doesn't do the same for the rest of them, and it causes a number of unique problems. Most of Skyward Sword's dungeons are incredibly linear and fairly easy to complete. I've never had a problem with that in Zelda dungeons before this game, though. I do love complicated and complex dungeons, like the ones in Majora's Mask, but I find if a dungeon uses its linearity to tell a unique story, expand on a theme, or as a way to teach you and build upon its mechanics through game design, it can be really satisfying to complete even if it is easy, which is why I love most of the dungeons in Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. Not only do half of Skyward Sword's dungeons fail to do this, but there's another major problem here, which is that both the dungeons and the overworld are extremely linear. I find free exploration in between linear segments to be kind of a necessary breather, so the gameplay doesn't feel too restrictive. Going from linear overworld to linear dungeon makes the experience feel like one long super dungeon, and there's very little optional content or free exploration, so it feels almost claustrophobic. I think the sky was intended to fill this purpose, but it's not enjoyable and there's nothing to do there, so it really doesn't help in the same way as riding Epona through Hyrule Field or sailing across the Great Sea. This was especially noticeable in Eldin's dungeons, which were both extremely linear and came after the extremely linear volcano. And since the dungeons were so similar to the volcano and each other, it felt like I was trapped in the volcano for hours on end. The Ancient Cistern avoids this problem by having such a unique theme from Faron and having sort of a more open design, but Skyview Temple feels like an extension of the already too long linear tutorial of Faron Woods, and it really suffers when it would normally just have been a forgettable first dungeon. Another particular issue with Skyward Sword is that written instructions are often used to tell players what to do next instead of letting you figure it out for yourself, and this absolutely impacts the dungeon design. I've talked about how encompassing this is in the Sandship, but almost every dungeon has examples of this. In the Fire Sanctuary, you're told at the start to jump into the mouth of a statue with closed eyes, and then later on, you just kind of do that. Skyview Temple is littered with stone tablets that tell you where the map is located and where to find gemstones that unlock doors. There's even one that just straight up tells you to ask Vi for help to proceed. And in the Earth Temple, Amagma tells you exactly where to find the bomb bag. If the written instructions were challenging in some way, I wouldn't have much of an issue here, but when a dungeon just tells you to walk somewhere or do a basic task to proceed, that sucks the fun and agency out of exploring for yourself. You're also often presented with puzzles and then told how to solve them. In the Ancient Cistern, you have to move the central statue up and then find a way to get underneath it. But before you can even figure out how you're to do it for yourself, there's a stone tablet that tells you exactly what to do. There's another segment in the Fire Sanctuary where two different characters approach you one after the other to tell you that there's a bombable wall nearby, so you should check your map to find out where it is. The only notable exception here is the mining facility, which is part of why it's my favorite dungeon. I'm sure you've noticed that I haven't even mentioned the final dungeon, but it kind of exists in a category of its own, so I'm going to be covering that one later on. When it comes to the rest of the dungeons, there's still one more thing to cover though. In the next part of this deep dive, I'll be talking about Skyward Sword's bosses, including how each dungeon boss impacts the dungeon that it's fought in, as well as the imprisoned. There will be a playlist in the description that'll update once that part is completed. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you there!